The morning light streamed through the half-open blinds, casting muted stripes across Thatcher Morland's face as he sat on the edge of the bed. His eyes lingered on the empty space beside him. Vivian had left early again, another urgent meeting at the office. It wasn't unusual these days. Their once shared mornings, filled with light-hearted banter and warm cups of coffee, had quietly eroded into hurried exits and silence. Thatcher rubbed his temples, the familiar weight of unease pressing against his chest. It wasn't just the loneliness, it was the growing chasm between them. He glanced over at the dresser, where a dusty photo frame still stood. The image inside showed a younger version of them, arms wrapped around each other, laughing under the golden glow of a summer sunset. That moment felt like a lifetime ago. Downstairs, the kitchen was eerily quiet. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, staring at the swirling steam. His mind wandered to Clara, their daughter, now away at college. She had always been the glue that held their family together. Thatcher missed her presence, the warmth of her voice, the way she filled the house with energy. Without her, the void felt unbearable. As he scrolled through emails, a message from his boss lit up the screen. Another audit project. Another endless week of mind-numbing calculations and late nights at the firm. Thatcher sighed. Once his career had been a source of pride, a symbol of his unwavering dedication. But now it felt like a hollow grind. The numbers on his spreadsheet seemed less meaningful with every passing day. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp vibration. His phone buzzed across the counter, signaling a text from Vivian. "Staying late tonight, don't wait up." No explanation, no apology. Just the same detached tone that had become her default. A pang of frustration shot through him. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers about the walls she had built around herself. But every attempt in the past had ended in deflection or icy silence. Vivian had a way of shutting him down with a single glance, a quiet dismissal that stung more than any argument. Thatcher stood and walked to the living room where a faint scent of her perfume still lingered. His gaze settled on the book she had left on the couch, its pages dog-eared and spine-creased. It was a romance novel, one of the few things she seemed passionate about lately. He reached for it but hesitated, his hand hovering over the cover. It wasn't his place anymore, was it? She had drawn a line, one he was no longer invited to cross. That evening, the house was shrouded in stillness. He made himself a simple dinner and ate alone, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound accompanying him. Memories of family dinners played in his mind, Clara's laughter, Vivian's teasing remarks. Now, all he had was the echo of his own thoughts. As the hours ticked by, Thatcher retreated to his office. Stacks of bills and documents cluttered the desk, a visual representation of his chaotic life. He stared blankly at a report, unable to focus. His mind kept circling back to Vivian, her distant smiles, her unexplained absences. Was it work? Was it something else? The questions gnawed at him. When the clock struck midnight, the sound of the front door opening jolted him. Vivian entered, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She didn't glance his way as she walked upstairs, her silhouette illuminated briefly by the hallway light. "Vivian!" he called out, his voice cracking slightly. She paused at the top of the stairs but didn't turn around. "What is it, Thatcher?" she asked, her tone devoid of warmth. Never mind." He swallowed his words, the knot in his throat tightening as she disappeared into the bedroom. As the night wore on, Thatcher sat alone in the dim glow of his office lamp. The silence was deafening, yet his mind raced with noise. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. He didn't know what yet, but he felt it in his bones. And for the first time he wasn't sure if he wanted to know the truth, or if it would destroy him. The sun was already low in the sky when Thatcher Morland parked his car in the driveway, his mind clouded with unease. The faint chirp of crickets greeted him as he stepped out, but the quiet of the neighborhood only deepened the hollow feeling in his chest. Vivian's car was in the driveway, but the lights inside the house were dim. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the same eerie stillness that had come to define their evenings. Thatcher's gaze swept across the room. Her coat was slung carelessly over a chair, her shoes abandoned near the door. She was home, but it didn't feel like it. "Viv?" he called, his voice echoing slightly. There was no answer. As he moved through the house, his steps grew heavier with each passing second. Finally, he found her in the den, curled up on the couch, engrossed in her phone. She didn't even glance up. "You didn't hear me come in?" he asked, his tone forced into a casualness he didn't feel. Vivian looked up briefly, her expression blank. "Oh, hey, I didn't realize you were back." Thatcher's chest tightened. He stood there, waiting for more. A smile, a question about his day, anything. But she simply returned her focus to the glowing screen in her hand. "What's for dinner?" he asked after a long pause. Vivian shrugged. "I grabbed something earlier. There's probably leftovers in the fridge." Leftovers. The word hung in the air like an accusation. He turned away, heading to the kitchen, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. As he opened the fridge, he noticed an untouched container of lasagna he'd prepared the night before. The realization stung, but it wasn't just the food. It was the pattern, the growing indifference. Later that evening, Thatcher sat in his office staring at a blank spreadsheet. His mind wandered back to Vivian. There had been subtle shifts for months now, but lately they'd felt sharper, more deliberate. The new perfume, the late nights, the constant texting. He'd even caught her smiling at her phone, a private, fleeting grin that wasn't meant for him. Thatcher had dismissed these things at first, attributing them to stress or coincidence. But tonight, the weight of them felt unbearable. He leaned back in his chair, his hands rubbing his temples as he tried to piece it all together. His heart whispered the question he was too afraid to voice. Was she hiding something? His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Clara. "Dad, just checking in. How are you doing?" A small smile tugged at his lips. Clara had always been perceptive, her intuition uncanny. Thatcher typed back a quick response. "I'm okay. How's school?" But before he could hit send, his fingers hesitated. Was he okay? The truth gnawed at him, and for a fleeting moment he considered confiding in his daughter. But no, this wasn't her burden to carry. The sound of Vivian's laughter drifted down the hall, faint but distinct. It wasn't her usual laugh, the one he'd known for years. This was softer, more intimate. Thatcher stood, his heart pounding, and followed the sound to their bedroom. He stopped in the doorway, his breath catching as he saw her sitting on the bed, her phone pressed to her ear. "I know," she said, her tone light and playful. "You're terrible." Thatcher's stomach turned. He wanted to burst in, to demand an explanation, but something held him back. Instead, he retreated to his office, his mind racing. He couldn't jump to conclusions. He needed proof, something concrete. But the knot in his chest told him he wasn't imagining things. That night, Thatcher lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Vivian slept beside him. The distance between them felt insurmountable, the silence oppressive. He closed his eyes, trying to will away the doubts, but they clung to him like shadows. "Tomorrow," he told himself. "Tomorrow I'll figure this out." The early morning sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the kitchen. Thatcher Moreland sat at the table, staring blankly at his coffee cup as steam spiraled upward. Across from him, Clara was eating breakfast, her eyes flicking between her plate and her father's drawn face. She'd noticed the growing shadows under his eyes, the heaviness in his shoulders. Something wasn't right. "Dad," Clara began, her voice tentative, "is everything okay?" Thatcher looked up, startled. He hadn't even realized she was watching him so closely. "Of course," he lied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just tired from work." Clara frowned, unconvinced. "You've been tired for weeks. Is it work or—" She hesitated, as if unsure whether to finish her thought. "Is it Mom?" Her words hit Thatcher like a punch to the gut. Clara wasn't the kind to pry, but her perceptiveness was uncanny. He wanted to dismiss her concerns, to reassure her that everything was fine, but the lump in his throat betrayed him. "She's been busy," he finally said, his voice strained. "You know how she is with work." Clara pushed her plate aside, leaning forward. "Dad, it's not just work. I've been home for 3 days, and you two barely talk. She's always on her phone or out late, and you—" Her voice softened. "You look miserable." Thatcher's chest tightened. He hadn't realized how transparent his emotions had become. or how much Clara had noticed. For a moment he debated telling her everything, the distance, the suspicion, the aching loneliness. But how could he burden her with that? "I'm fine, Clara," he said quietly, though his voice wavered. "Don't worry about me." Clara reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "I do worry, Dad. I worry because you deserve to be happy. You used to laugh more, smile more. Now it feels like you're just going through the motions." Her words pierced through him, bringing tears to the corners of his eyes. He blinked them away quickly, ashamed to show weakness in front of his daughter. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm okay." Clara wasn't convinced, and her expression said as much. I want you to think about yourself for once. You always put everyone else first. But maybe it's time to ask if you're really happy." Thatcher swallowed hard, his throat tightening as her words sank in. Was he happy? The question lingered in his mind long after Clara excused herself to pack for her trip back to school. He sat alone in the kitchen, the silence around him feeling heavier than ever. Later that morning, Clara stood at the door with her suitcase ready to leave. Thatcher hugged her tightly, reluctant to let go. "Be safe, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She pulled back, looking up at him with a mix of sadness and determination. "Dad, don't let this go on forever. You deserve better." Thatcher nodded, unable to speak. As he watched her drive away, her words echoed in his mind. She was right. He couldn't let things continue like this. Something had to change, but the thought of confronting it filled him with dread. That evening, Thatcher found himself sitting in the den, alone once again. Vivian hadn't come home yet, and the house felt emptier than ever. He stared at the photo of their family on the mantel, his heart aching. He thought about Clara's parting words, the sadness in her eyes when she spoke. For so long he had convinced himself that enduring was enough, that keeping the family intact for Clara's sake was worth the sacrifice. But now, with her gone, he realized how hollow that justification had become. He wasn't just losing Vivian, he was losing himself. The sound of the front door opening startled him from his thoughts. Vivian entered, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She looked up briefly, her expression unreadable. "I'm going to bed," she said flatly before disappearing down the hall. Thatcher sat frozen, his heart pounding. Clara's voice echoed in his mind. "You deserve to be happy." For the first time in months, Thatcher allowed himself to wonder what that might look like, and if he could ever find it again. The morning breeze carried the faint scent of blooming lilacs as Thatcher Moreland stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the empty street below. He held his coffee mug tightly, the warmth seeping into his hands, grounding him. It had been 2 days since Clara left for college, and her absence amplified the unsettling stillness in the house. Vivian was already gone. She hadn't said goodbye that morning, just the usual brief note on the kitchen counter. "Early meeting. Don't wait for me." Thatcher's eyes lingered on the words, his stomach twisting with unease. The handwriting seemed rushed, the words impersonal, like a message left for a stranger. The change had been gradual, but now it felt undeniable. Vivian had always been meticulous, but lately there was an edge to her, an intentional effort to appear perfect. Her outfits, once practical and understated, now seemed curated for attention. She wore perfume he didn't recognize, its floral scent clinging to her as she brushed past him in the mornings. And the phone, always in her hand, its screen lighting up with messages she never shared. Thatcher's chest tightened as he recalled the other night. He had walked into the bedroom to find her laughing softly at something on her phone, her expression more animated than he had seen in months. When he asked what was so funny, she had tucked the device away quickly, her smile vanishing. "Just work stuff," she'd said. But her tone had been clipped, defensive. The memory gnawed at him now. What had changed? What was she hiding? Later that day, Thatcher returned home from the grocery store to find Vivian in the living room, dressed to go out. She was applying lipstick in the mirror, her reflection poised and confident. "Heading somewhere?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "A dinner with some colleagues," she replied without looking at him. "Networking." Thatcher nodded slowly, though the explanation did little to ease his discomfort. "You've been going out a lot lately," he said, his voice betraying the hint of an accusation. Vivian finally turned to face him, her expression neutral. "It's part of my job, Thatcher. You know that." He wanted to press further, to ask why these outings felt different, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he watched as she grabbed her bag and walked past him, her perfume trailing behind her. That night, Thatcher sat alone at the dining table, his untouched plate growing cold. The silence in the house was deafening, punctuated only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. His mind raced with fragments of conversations, the sharp contrasts between their shared past and this growing void. Unable to bear the isolation, he retreated to his office. As he sifted through emails, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a notification from their shared calendar. "Vivian, dinner with client." Thatcher stared at the entry, his jaw tightening. Her increasing absences and cryptic explanations were no longer coincidences. Something was wrong. He could feel it. The next morning he woke early, determined to shake the unease that clung to him like a shadow. As he poured his coffee, his gaze landed on Vivian's jacket draped over a chair. He reached into the pocket absent-mindedly, feeling a crumpled receipt. Pulling it out, he scanned the details. An upscale restaurant in the city, the time stamped well past midnight. Thatcher's pulse quickened. Vivian hadn't mentioned this outing. The realization hit him hard. A mix of anger and hurt swelling in his chest. Was it just work? Or was there more to her late nights than she let on? He folded the receipt carefully and tucked it back into her jacket. Confronting her now would only lead to another deflection, another wall thrown up between them. No, he needed clarity, something undeniable. As he sat at the kitchen table, the morning sun casting long shadows across the room, Thatcher felt the weight of his suspicions deepen. He couldn't shake the growing sense that the woman he had once known so intimately was slipping away from him piece by piece. Thatcher Morland sat on the worn leather stool at Leighton Harrow's bar, his fingers tracing the rim of his untouched glass of bourbon. The low hum of chatter around him was a blur, drowned out by the storm of thoughts in his mind. "You've barely touched that," Leighton said as he slid onto the stool next to him, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "Something on your mind?" Thatcher hesitated. He hadn't planned to confide in anyone, especially not Leighton. But the weight in his chest felt unbearable. "It's Vivian," he admitted, his voice low. "Something's different. She's distant, always on her phone, out late. It's like she's hiding something." Leighton frowned, his gaze sharp. "You think she's cheating?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken until now. Thatcher exhaled shakily. "I don't know, but I can't ignore the signs anymore." Leighton leaned back, his brows furrowing in thought. "Look, man, if your gut is telling you something's wrong, it probably is. You don't have to confront her without knowing. There are ways to find out." Thatcher shook his head. "I don't want to jump to conclusions. What if I'm wrong? What if it's just stress or something else?" "And what if you're not?" Leighton countered. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You need answers, not assumptions. I know someone who can help, Fletcher Dawes. He's a private investigator, discreet, thorough, and he doesn't mess around." Thatcher stared at his drink, the idea settling uneasily in his mind. It felt intrusive, like a betrayal of the trust they once had. But then he thought of the late nights, the unexplained dinners, the receipt he found. His stomach churned. Wasn't it already broken? "Give me his number," Thatcher said quietly, his voice tinged with resignation. The next day, Thatcher sat in his car outside Fletcher Dawes's modest office, his palms slick with sweat. He hesitated before stepping out, the weight of what he was about to do pressing heavily on his chest. When he finally entered, Fletcher greeted him with a firm handshake and an air of quiet confidence. "What can I do for you, Mr. Morland?" Fletcher asked as they settled into his small office. Thatcher hesitated, his voice faltering as he explained the situation. The words felt foreign as they left his mouth, but once he started, they tumbled out uncontrollably, the distance, the changes, the suspicion. Fletcher listened intently, his expression unreadable. "I can help you," Fletcher said finally, "but I need you to be prepared for what I might find. Once we start, there's no turning back." Thatcher nodded, his jaw tightening. "I just need to know the truth." Fletcher slid a contract across the desk. "We'll start with surveillance. Track her movements, gather evidence. It's invasive. I won't sugarcoat it. But if there's something going on, we'll find it." As Thatcher signed the papers, his hands trembled slightly. He couldn't believe it had come to this. The thought of Vivian's betrayal was like a blade twisting in his gut, but the doubt was worse. He needed clarity, no matter how painful it might be. Days turned into a week, and Fletcher kept him updated in measured tones. "She's been meeting someone," Fletcher reported during their first phone call. "A man, dinner, drinks. Nothing definitive yet, but it's enough to warrant suspicion." Thatcher's heart sank. He clenched the phone tightly, his knuckles white. "Keep digging," he said through gritted teeth. By the end of the second week, Fletcher had gathered more. Photos, timestamps, locations, pieces of a puzzle Thatcher had hoped wouldn't fit together. The man was Dorian Fawkes, a name Thatcher recognized from one of Vivian's work functions. He felt sick. That evening, Fletcher handed Thatcher an envelope containing the evidence. Thatcher sat in his car, staring at it for what felt like hours. His fingers trembled as he opened it, each photograph like a dagger to his chest. Vivian laughing over dinner, her hand brushing against Dorian's. The intimacy in their body language was undeniable. Thatcher closed the envelope, his jaw set. The truth was clearer now, but the path forward felt impossibly blurred. Thatcher Morland stared at his phone as it buzzed on the kitchen counter. Fletcher Dawes's name flashing on the screen. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of dread and determination swirling inside him. This was the call he'd been waiting for, but also the one he'd feared most. He picked up the phone, his voice faltering slightly. "This is Thatcher." "Good evening, Mr. Morland," Fletcher said, his tone calm but professional. "I've got some preliminary findings. It's not definitive, but it's enough to warrant a closer look." Thatcher gripped the counter for support. "What did you find?" "There's a man," Fletcher began. "They've been meeting regularly. Dinner here, drinks there. I've got photos and timestamps if you're ready to see them." Thatcher's breath caught. He forced himself to respond. "I'll come by your office." The drive to Fletcher's office felt like an eternity, each passing streetlight casting shadows across the interior of his car. His mind raced with possibilities, scenarios he had tried to push away but could no longer ignore. By the time he arrived, his hands were trembling. Fletcher greeted him at the door, his expression unreadable. "Come in." Inside, Fletcher laid a manila envelope on the desk between them. "Take your time." Thatcher hesitated, staring at the envelope as if it were a living thing. Finally, he reached for it, pulling out the contents. The first photo was innocuous enough. Vivian sitting at a restaurant table, her phone in hand. But the next one hit him like a punch to the gut. She wasn't alone. Across from her sat a man, his posture casual, his smile easy. Thatcher recognized him immediately, Dorian Fawkes. His breath quickened as he flipped through the rest. The photos told a story he wasn't ready to hear, the two of them laughing over drinks, their heads leaning in closer than necessary. A lingering touch on the hand, a shared look that spoke volumes. "She said it was work," Thatcher muttered, his voice barely audible. "She told me it was just work." Fletcher nodded, his expression sympathetic but firm. "It's possible there's more to it. I'll need more time to confirm anything concrete, but the signs are there." Thatcher slumped back in his chair, the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. He felt a mix of emotions, anger, betrayal, humiliation, but most of all, an aching sadness. This was the woman he had built his life with, the one he had trusted above all else, and now that foundation felt like it was crumbling beneath him. "What do I do?" Thatcher asked, his voice cracking. Fletcher leaned forward. "You let me finish the job. If there's something going on, I'll find out. You deserve the truth." Thatcher nodded, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was too compelling to ignore. "Keep going. I need to know." Over the next few days, Thatcher carried the weight of the photos like a stone in his chest. Each time Vivian walked through the door, her perfume wafting through the air, he found himself searching her face for signs of guilt, but she gave nothing away. Her smiles were practiced, her conversations surface level, as if everything were perfectly normal. One evening, as she prepared to leave for another networking event, Thatcher's resolve hardened. He watched her slip on her heels, her movements fluid and confident. "Don't wait up," she said, her tone breezy. He wanted to stop her, to confront her with the photos, but he held back. Fletcher's words echoed in his mind. "You deserve the truth." He needed more than suspicion. He needed certainty. As the door closed behind her, Thatcher sat alone in the living room, the silence of the house almost suffocating. He pulled out the photos once more, his fingers tracing the edges of the glossy prints. Each image felt like a dagger, but he couldn't look away. For now, he would wait. But the storm was brewing, and Thatcher knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. Thatcher Morland sat motionless in his car, parked a block away from the small hotel Fletcher Dawes had directed him to. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white against the dark leather. The quiet hum of the engine seemed deafening against the thundering rhythm of his heart. "Are you sure about this?" Fletcher's voice echoed in his mind, the question he'd posed over the phone earlier. Thatcher hadn't been sure then, and he wasn't sure now. But here he was. The call from Fletcher had come late the previous evening. "We've got something," the investigator had said, his tone measured but firm. "You might want to see this for yourself." Now Thatcher stared at the glowing hotel sign in the distance, each letter a taunt. He hadn't wanted to believe it. He still didn't. But the breadcrumbs had led him here, and denial could no longer shield him from the truth. He reached for his phone, scrolling to Fletcher's text. "Room 312. Lobby camera confirms." The simplicity of the message made his stomach churn. Vivian's betrayal wasn't an abstract suspicion anymore. It had a location, a timestamp. It was real. Thatcher took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at his skin. His legs felt heavy as he approached the hotel, each step deliberate yet reluctant. The lobby was dimly lit, the receptionist barely looking up as he passed. The elevator ride was agonizingly slow, every ding of the floors another twist of the knife. When the elevator doors slid open, Thatcher found himself staring down a nondescript hallway. Room 312 was at the end, the door standing between him and the confirmation he dreaded. He hesitated, his chest tight with a cocktail of anger, sadness, and a faint, futile hope that this was all a mistake. The hallway was silent except for the faint sound of laughter spilling from the room ahead. Thatcher froze. It was her laugh, Vivian's laugh, light, musical, and unguarded in a way he hadn't heard in years. His breath hitched as another voice joined hers, deeper and unfamiliar. Dorian. Thatcher's vision blurred with the sting of tears, his fists clenching at his sides. He forced himself forward, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the door, he stopped, his hand hovering over the handle. From inside, snippets of conversation filtered through. Their voices were soft, intimate. Thatcher felt the walls close in around him, the weight of the moment pressing down like an anchor. He had seen photos, read texts, but hearing them together made the betrayal tangible. He clenched his jaw, swallowing back the shout that burned in his throat. He didn't knock. He didn't want to see their faces, not like this. Instead, he turned and walked away, his legs moving on autopilot back to the elevator. As he descended, his breathing came in shallow bursts, his mind racing. The truth was inescapable now. There was no room for doubt. By the time Thatcher reached his car, his chest heaved with the effort of holding himself together. He climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, gripping the steering wheel so tightly it groaned under the pressure. He wanted to scream, to rage, but the only sound that escaped was a choked sob. His world, the life he had built with Vivian, had shattered. He stared out the windshield at the empty street, his vision blurred with tears. The weight of her betrayal pressed down on him, crushing the air from his lungs. He thought of Clara, of the family they had once been, of every small moment Vivian had stolen by being here, with Dorian, instead of at home. Thatcher's phone buzzed on the console, pulling him from his spiral. It was a text from Fletcher. "We've got everything. Call me when you're ready to talk." He stared at the screen for a long moment before placing the phone face down. He wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. Not tonight. Instead, he sat in the stillness of his car, the evidence he didn't need burning in his memory. The proof was concrete, undeniable. The next steps were his to decide, but in that moment, Thatcher could only sit with the weight of knowing and the pain of realizing his life would never be the same. Thatcher Morland sat at the dining table, the envelope of evidence Fletcher had delivered lying in front of him. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the kitchen clock, each second stretching into an eternity. His hands rested flat against the table, trembling ever so slightly as he stared at the damning photographs and transcripts. This was it. The truth laid bare. There was no escaping it now. He glanced at the time. Vivian would be home soon. For days he'd rehearsed what he wanted to say, but the words felt foreign, caught in his throat every time he tried to speak them aloud. His emotions surged like a storm, anger, betrayal, sadness, and even a flicker of love that refused to be extinguished. He hated that part of himself most of all. The sound of the front door opening jolted him from his thoughts. He straightened in his chair, his heart pounding as her heels clicked against the hardwood floor. Vivian appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable as she set her bag down on the counter. "You're home early," she said, her voice casual, but Thatcher caught the slight hesitation in her tone. "I needed to talk to you," he replied, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. Vivian raised an eyebrow, leaning against the counter. "What's this about?" Thatcher gestured to the envelope. "Sit down." Her eyes flicked to the table, her brow furrowing slightly as she moved to take the seat across from him. She reached for the envelope, but Thatcher placed his hand over it, stopping her. "Before you look at this," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I need you to tell me the truth. No lies, no deflections. Just tell me the truth, Vivian." Vivian's gaze hardened, her defenses rising instantly. "Thatcher, what are you talking about?" He pushed the envelope toward her, his jaw tightening. "Open it." She hesitated, her hand hovering over the flap before finally pulling it open. As she sifted through the photos and transcripts, her expression shifted from confusion to shock, then to a guarded calm that made Thatcher's stomach churn. She set the photos down slowly, folding her hands in her lap. "You were spying on me?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. "I had no choice," Thatcher shot back, his voice breaking with emotion. "You weren't honest with me. I knew something was wrong, Vivian. I felt it every time you walked out that door. And now I know." Vivian's lips tightened, and for a moment she said nothing. Finally she exhaled, her shoulders slumping slightly. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she murmured, almost to herself. "Like what?" Thatcher demanded, his voice rising. "You've been lying to me, betraying me. Do you have any idea what this has done to me? To us?" "I didn't plan this, Thatcher," she said, her voice trembling. "It just happened. I didn't mean for it to go this far." "That doesn't make it right." Thatcher slammed his hand against the table, the sound reverberating through the room. "We built a life together, Vivian. We raised Clara. I gave you everything I had, and this is how you repay me?" Vivian looked down at her hands, her silence deafening. For the first time, Thatcher saw something break in her. Guilt, shame, or perhaps regret. But it wasn't enough. It couldn't be. "I don't even know who you are anymore," he said quietly, his voice thick with pain. Vivian looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm sorry, Thatcher. I know that doesn't mean much, but I am. I wasn't happy. And I didn't know how to tell you." Thatcher stared at her, his chest tightening. Her words cut deeper than the betrayal itself. He stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You should have told me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You owed me that much." Vivian didn't respond, and Thatcher turned away, walking toward the stairs. He paused at the foot, gripping the banister tightly. "I'll sleep in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out what happens next." Without waiting for a reply, he climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the guest room, he closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his breathing ragged. The confrontation was over, but the battle within him had just begun. The envelope lay on the kitchen counter, stark against the dark granite surface. Thatcher Morland stood staring at it, his breath uneven, his chest tightening with each passing second. It was a moment he had braced himself for, yet the reality of it felt like a hammer to his chest. His name was printed neatly on the label, and beneath it the familiar handwriting of Vivian, a cruel reminder of how meticulously she handled everything, even the end of their marriage. He reached for it slowly, his hand trembling. Pulling the envelope open, the papers slid out effortlessly, their contents blunt and final. At the top of the stack, bold letters spelled it out: Petition for dissolution of marriage. Thatcher's knees felt weak, but he steadied himself against the counter, forcing his eyes to keep reading. Vivian's terms were clear. She wanted the house, the cars, and a clean division of assets. There was no mention of reconciliation, no olive branch hidden among the legal jargon. It was as though she had taken a scalpel to their life together, carving out what she wanted and discarding the rest. Him. The sound of the front door opening broke through the suffocating silence. Vivian walked in, her heels clicking softly on the floor. She froze when she saw him holding the papers, their eyes meeting for the briefest, most painful moment. "I see you've received them," she said, her voice measured, devoid of emotion. Thatcher swallowed hard, his throat dry. "You couldn't even talk to me first? This is how you end it? With a packet of papers and a courier?" Vivian exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I didn't think there was anything left to say. Last week, after our conversation, it was clear where we stood." "No," Thatcher snapped, slamming the papers onto the counter. "It's clear where you stand. You've already moved on. You made that decision months ago, didn't you?" Her expression flickered, the mask slipping for just a moment before she composed herself again. "I won't apologize for wanting something different, Thatcher. I've tried to make this work. We've both tried. But we're not the same people we were 20 years ago. And whose fault is that?" His voice cracked, the raw emotion spilling out despite his best efforts to contain it. "I gave you everything, Vivian. My time, my love, my loyalty. You gave me lies." "I didn't lie," she said defensively, crossing her arms. "I just didn't tell you everything." Thatcher laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp. "And that's supposed to make this better? Do you even hear yourself?" Vivian's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she moved past him to pour herself a glass of water, her movements deliberate and detached. Thatcher watched her, a storm of anger and grief swirling inside him. How could she be so calm while everything around them was falling apart? "Was it worth it?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "Dorian, was he worth tearing this apart?" She froze, the glass hovering near her lips. For a moment, the room felt impossibly still. "It wasn't about him," she said finally, her tone soft but firm. "It was about me. I needed to feel alive again, Thatcher, and I didn't feel that with you anymore." The words struck him harder than he expected. He turned away, gripping the back of a chair to steady himself. "So that's it then. You found your escape and I'm just collateral damage." Vivian set the glass down, her voice wavering slightly. "I never meant to hurt you, but I can't keep pretending, and I won't ask you to either." Thatcher nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He reached for the papers, his hand steady now. "You've made your choice, Vivian, and I'll sign these. But don't mistake this for forgiveness." She didn't respond, her eyes glossy, but her resolve unbroken. Thatcher walked past her, the papers in hand, and disappeared into his office. As he closed the door, the realization washed over him. This chapter of his life was ending, not with a bang, but with a single stroke of a pen. The house felt emptier than ever, a hollow shell of what it once had been. Thatcher Moreland stood in the kitchen, staring at the bare walls where family photos used to hang. Vivian had taken most of them when she moved out, leaving only faint outlines where the frames once rested. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the silence around him both oppressive and liberating. It had been 2 weeks since the divorce was finalized. 2 weeks of waking up to an empty bed, 2 weeks of grappling with emotions he hadn't yet learned to name. But amidst the sorrow, something unexpected had begun to emerge. Clarity. That morning, Thatcher decided he couldn't live like this anymore, not in a house that bore too many ghosts of the past. He grabbed a notebook and began listing all the things he had put off for years, things he once enjoyed, things he wanted to try. Each word he wrote felt like a spark of light in the dark corners of his mind. The first step was the garage. It had been cluttered for years, a chaotic collection of tools, forgotten projects, and broken dreams. He spent hours clearing it out, filling trash bags with items he no longer needed. As he worked, a strange sense of satisfaction settled over him. The physical act of discarding felt symbolic. Each item tossed was a weight lifted. When he finally finished, Thatcher stepped back to admire the open space. It wasn't much, but it was his. He wiped the sweat from his brow and smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. The next day, he called Leighton Harrow, his oldest friend, and arranged to meet for lunch. Leighton had been a steady presence during the chaos, offering support without judgment. "You look better," Leighton remarked as Thatcher sat down. "Lighter." Thatcher chuckled softly. "I don't know if I'm better, but I'm trying. I can't keep drowning in what happened. Vivian made her choice, and I need to make mine." Leighton nodded, raising his glass. "To new beginnings." Thatcher clinked his glass against Leighton's, the toast feeling both simple and monumental. Over the next few weeks, Thatcher began exploring life beyond the shadows of his marriage. He joined a local gym, pushing his body in ways he hadn't since his 20s. At first, every movement felt like punishment, a reminder of how far he'd let himself go. But with each session he grew stronger, his confidence inching back piece by piece. One Saturday, he drove to the countryside, revisiting a hiking trail he and Clara had loved when she was a child. The air was crisp, the trail winding through golden fields and dense woods. As he climbed higher, Thatcher felt something stir within him, a connection to himself he hadn't felt in years. At the summit, he sat on a rocky ledge, gazing out at the sprawling landscape. For the first time, the vastness didn't intimidate him. It inspired him. On the way back, he stopped at a local cafe where the aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods drew him inside. As he waited for his order, his eyes wandered to a notice board filled with flyers. A small card caught his attention. Art classes for adults, no experience needed. He tore off a tab and tucked it into his pocket. That evening, Thatcher sat at his dining table staring at the card. He had always admired art, but had never imagined himself as someone who could create it. The thought of trying something new both excited and terrified him. After a long moment, he dialed the number, his voice steady as he signed up for the first class. The weeks that followed were transformative. The art class became a sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in colors and shapes, in the simple act of creating. It wasn't about skill or perfection, it was about expression, and for the first time in years, Thatcher felt truly free. One night, as he stood in his now decluttered garage, a half-finished canvas in front of him, he realized something profound. The pain of losing Vivian would always be a part of him, but it didn't have to define him. He had the power to rebuild, to become someone new. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, Thatcher felt like he was heading in the right direction. The air was thick with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the comforting hum of quiet chatter. Thatcher Moreland sat near the window of a small cafe on the outskirts of Cedar Springs, his sketch pad open before him. He wasn't much of an artist yet, but the act of drawing soothed him, giving his restless hands something to focus on. It had been months since the divorce, and life was beginning to feel less like an endless void and more like a blank canvas. He was slowly learning to paint a new picture, one that didn't include Vivian. Yet the edges of that canvas still felt rough, unpolished. As he stared down at the jagged lines of his current attempt, the sound of a soft laugh caught his attention. He looked up to see a woman entering the cafe, her presence both unassuming and magnetic. She had auburn hair pulled into a loose braid, strands escaping to frame her face. Her warm hazel eyes scanned the room briefly before she approached the counter, where she exchanged pleasantries with the barista. Something about her drew Thatcher's gaze. It wasn't just her appearance. It was the way she seemed so at ease, as though she belonged in every space she entered. She exuded a quiet confidence that was rare and, to Thatcher, almost enviable. He quickly averted his eyes, embarrassed by his sudden interest, and returned to his sketch pad. Moments later, the scrape of a chair across the wooden floor startled him. He looked up to find the woman sitting at the table next to his, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, and a novel tucked under her arm. She caught his gaze and smiled, a gesture so genuine it made his chest tighten unexpectedly. "Looks like I interrupted an artist at work," she said, nodding toward his sketch pad. Thatcher chuckled nervously, running a hand through his hair. "Hardly. I'm more of an aspiring artist, or maybe just a guy trying not to look too out of place." Her laugh was soft but sincere. "Well, I think it's brave to try something new. Most people are too afraid of failing to even begin." Her words caught him off guard. It wasn't often someone saw through him so quickly, especially a stranger. "I guess I hadn't thought of it that way," he admitted. "I'm Thatcher, by the way." "Laura," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm yet warm, a stark contrast to the cold formality he'd grown used to. They spent the next few minutes chatting casually, their conversation flowing with surprising ease. Laura told him about her work at a local bakery, how she had taken it over after her parents retired. Thatcher found himself genuinely captivated by her stories, her passion for her craft evident in every word. "So what brings you to Cedar Springs?" she asked, her head tilted slightly as she studied him. Thatcher hesitated, the familiar weight of his past creeping into his chest. But something about Laura's openness made him feel safe, like he didn't have to hide. "I'm rebuilding, I guess," he said finally. "Life threw me a curveball, and now I'm trying to figure out what's next." Laura nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Rebuilding isn't easy, but it's worth it. Sometimes the pieces come together in ways you never expect." Her words stayed with him long after they parted ways that day. Thatcher left the cafe feeling lighter than he had in months, his mind replaying their conversation. Laura's presence had been brief, yet it lingered like the scent of fresh bread wafting through the air, comforting, inviting, and impossible to ignore. That night, as he sat in his garage-turned art studio, Thatcher found himself sketching her face from memory. He wasn't sure why, but it felt right. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared to name: hope. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, casting warm golden light across the small living room. Thatcher Moreland stood by the window, holding a steaming cup of coffee, his gaze drawn to the garden just outside. The tiny plot of land, once overgrown and neglected, was now alive with vibrant flowers and fresh herbs, a symbol of the life he was beginning to cultivate. It had been nearly 6 months since he first met Laura at the cafe, and in that time his world had quietly, almost imperceptibly, begun to shift. Where there had once been emptiness, there was now a sense of purpose. Where there had been doubt, there was now a growing confidence in who he was becoming. The sound of soft laughter pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Laura sitting cross-legged on the floor, sketching designs for her bakery's new menu. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight, glowing like a halo. She looked up at him, her smile bright and unguarded. "You're staring again," she teased. Thatcher chuckled, shaking his head. "Can you blame me?" Her laughter filled the room, warm and infectious, and Thatcher felt a pang of gratitude so profound it nearly brought tears to his eyes. Laura had become his anchor, her unwavering support a balm to the wounds he hadn't realized were still healing. Later that day, they walked hand in hand through the bustling farmers' market in Cedar Springs. The air was filled with the scent of freshly baked bread, ripe fruit, and wildflowers. Laura stopped to admire a booth selling handmade pottery, her eyes lighting up as she ran her fingers over the smooth, glazed surfaces. "This one," she said, holding up a small, imperfect bowl. "It's not perfect, but there's something about it that feels real." Thatcher took the bowl from her, turning it over in his hands. "Kind of like life," he mused. "Imperfect, but still beautiful." She looked at him, her expression softening. "Exactly." As they left the market, Thatcher found himself thinking about how far he had come since the divorce. The pain had once felt insurmountable, a weight he would carry forever. But now it seemed distant, like a storm that had passed, leaving behind a clear sky. That evening they sat by the fire pit in his backyard, the flames crackling softly. Thatcher leaned back in his chair, watching Laura sip her wine as she gazed up at the stars. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. After everything, I didn't think it was possible. Laura turned to him, her eyes shimmering in the firelight. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Thatcher. You didn't just survive, you grew. That takes courage. He squeezed her hand, the words sinking into his heart. For so long he had defined himself by what he had lost, by the pieces of his life that had been taken from him. But now, he realized, he had the power to rebuild, not in spite of the pain, but because of it. I think I'm ready, he said suddenly, the conviction in his voice surprising even himself. Ready for what? Laura asked, tilting her head curiously. For whatever comes next, he replied, a smile breaking across his face. With you. She smiled back, her grip on his hand tightening. Then let's see where this goes. They sat in comfortable silence, the crackling fire and the chirping crickets their only companions. For the first time in years, Thatcher felt truly at peace. His journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he was excited about the road ahead. The stars above seemed to burn a little brighter, as if reflecting the quiet hope that now filled his heart. And as he sat beside Laura, her head resting on his shoulder, Thatcher knew with certainty that this was the beginning of something beautiful. What do you think of Thatcher's journey and his transformation? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And don't miss more heartwarming tales. Click here on the end screen to explore more.